200 Apache warriors, a perfectly terrifying line, sat motionless on their horses, etched against the raw horizon. Their eyes, dark and unblinking, were fixed on Elias McCready's ranch house. Not one moved, not one spoke. They just waited. In that deadly stillness, a cold dread coiled in Elias's gut, a sickening certainty telling him something had gone terribly, irrevocably wrong. Comment 1 if you'd pick up your rifle like you did in the last story. But if you're curious, then hit subscribe, because what happens next will turn everything we thought we knew upside down. He pressed his back against the rough, splintered cedar wall of the feed shed, the cold steel of his Winchester trembling, almost vibrating in his weathered hands. Through a narrow, dust-choked crack in the boards, he saw them clearly. Painted faces stark against bronze skin, eagle feathers woven into their black hair, lances glinting like cruel promises under the indifferent sun. Their gaze was fixed solely on his land, his isolated patch of existence in this unforgiving wilderness. There was no shouting, no blood-curdling war cries, just a profound, deliberate silence, a stillness that felt less like the absence of sound and more like the calm, predatory breath of a mountain lion before it springs. Elias was no stranger to fear. He'd lived through the slow agony of droughts that turned his fields to dust, the sudden terror of cattle raids that stripped him bare, and the crushing, soul-deep winter that had stolen his wife, Anna, and their bright-eyed daughter, Maggie, to the insidious grip of fever. Each loss had carved another line onto his face, etched another layer of solitude into his spirit. Yet nothing, absolutely nothing in his long, hard life had prepared him for this. The Mescalero, known for their fierce independence and swift, brutal strikes, did not ride in such overwhelming numbers unless blood had already been spilled, unless something sacred, something profoundly taboo had been touched. And then, like a shard of ice piercing his very being, one horrible thought, sharp and undeniable, froze the air in his lungs. The boy. It had to be the boy. That Apache child, barely 13 summers, a wisp of life already fading. He'd stumbled upon just yesterday by the winding creek that snaked through Elias's forgotten property. The child had been wounded, bleeding, alone, a small, fragile heap of humanity against the vast indifference of the prairie. Elias hadn't known what tribe he belonged to, hadn't understood what desperate flight he was escaping. He had simply seen a child, dying, fading fast, a memory of his own Maggie's last fragile breaths searing into his mind. He'd acted without thought, purely from a deep, aching well of decency that defied his chosen isolation. He'd wrapped the small, trembling body in the last thing his wife, Anna, had ever made, a thick, hand-stitched wool blanket, dyed a deep blue, adorned with intricate mountain patterns she'd learned from her own grandmother. He had stayed with him, silently, a lone sentinel against the encroaching shadow, as the young life, nameless and unknown, slipped away into the vast, indifferent sky. Now 200 hardened warriors, men forged by sun and battle, surrounded his desolate ranch. They stood like ancient guardians around a sacred burial site, a place of profound significance. But no tombstone marked this spot, no warning had been given, no declaration of war. Only this impossible, heavy silence, and the haunting, almost spectral memory of a simple kindness Elias had never meant as anything more than a fleeting act of human decency, a final, wordless comfort for a dying child. He hadn't sought reward, hadn't expected gratitude.
He had merely offered warmth in the face of cold oblivion. Then, with a deliberate, almost measured grace that spoke of immense unspoken authority, the lead warrior dismounted. Every movement was slow, purposeful, echoing with a chilling, disciplined power. He moved not like a raider preparing for plunder, but like a judge, a figure of uncompromising ancient law arriving to deliver a verdict. And in that terrifying, silent descent from his horse, Elias knew with chilling, absolute clarity that this was not a raid for cattle or land. This was not even a skirmish for blood. This was a reckoning, a spiritual accounting that transcended the brutal realities of the frontier, pulling him into a world he had never known, a destiny he could not possibly escape. The lead warrior moved with the slow, deliberate steps of a man used to commanding death, each moccasin soundless on the dry earth. Even from across the dust-choked yard, Elias could see the intricate scars crisscrossing his chest, tribal marks of courage and endurance. Eagle feathers, symbols of wisdom and strength, were woven into his long black hair. He walked forward alone, a solitary, imposing figure, while behind him 200 Apache warriors remained as still as carved obsidian, their gazes unwavering, their presence a palpable weight in the suffocating silence. Elias didn't move. He didn't breathe. He didn't dare. This was not a chaotic raiding party, not the kind of desperate attack he'd heard whispered about in distant saloon tales. This was something older, deeper, something rooted in ritual and an uncompromising sense of purpose. When the warrior finally stopped, a mere 20 feet from the feed shed door, Elias felt those dark, piercing eyes searching through the narrow wooden slats, as if the Apache knew precisely where the rancher was hiding, as if the shed itself was transparent. A shiver, colder than any Kansas winter, ran down Elias's spine. Then, in a moment that sent ice-cold dread through his veins, the warrior spoke. In perfect, unaccented English. "Elias McCready," the voice rang out, deep and smooth, carrying easily on the wind, a melodic rumble that defied the harsh landscape. "I am Standing Eagle of the Mescalero Apache. We need to talk." He knew his name. The words struck Elias with the force of a physical blow. Elias's heart slammed against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence. Not just because this formidable Apache leader knew who he was, an isolated rancher almost forgotten by the outside world, but because of how he said it, with a tone devoid of menace, brimming instead with a chilling, unsettling respect. That was far worse than fury, for it implied a deeper, more profound connection, a recognition of something Elias couldn't yet grasp. Fury, he understood. Respect from an enemy in such circumstances was utterly alien. Standing Eagle took another slow, deliberate step forward, his hands empty, held open in a gesture of non-aggression, his voice calm and unwavering. "Yesterday, beside the creek that cuts through your land, something happened. Something my people have never seen from a white man." Elias's mind reeled, racing back to the fragile, dying boy, the small, cold body, the blanket, the silent vigil. "I didn't know who he was," Elias called out hoarsely, stepping just far enough from the relative safety of the shed's cover to be heard, his Winchester still clutched tightly in his hand, its barrel pointing vaguely towards the dust. "He was just a boy." The words felt inadequate, hollow in the face of the silent army. The Apache leader held up a hand, a single, decisive motion for silence. "You gave him a blanket. You stayed with him. You honored his spirit as he crossed into the next world." His words were not an accusation, but a statement of fact, delivered with a solemn weight that hinted at profound meaning. "I didn't know it was an Apache ritual," Elias muttered, the words a desperate, clumsy attempt to explain, to deflect, to return to the simple, practical world he understood. "That is why it matters,"
Standing Eagle replied, his voice softening imperceptibly, yet gaining an immense spiritual authority. It was done without knowing, without expectation, without reward. That makes it pure. The words fell like heavy stones into a deep well of silence, rippling outward, filling the space between them with something far more complex than simple conflict. Elias took a shaky step forward, still clutching his Winchester, but instinctively lowering the barrel, recognizing on some primal level that this was not a fight to be won with lead. "Why are you here, then? If I did something good, why send an army?" His voice cracked, desperation and confusion warring within him. "Because goodness carries weight," Standing Eagle said, his eyes deep and knowing fixed on Elias's. "And in our tradition, the one who comforts a dying warrior becomes bound to him. His final thoughts, his breath, his soul, part of it rests with you now." Elias's fingers tightened around the cold steel of the rifle, the familiar weight suddenly alien and useless. This was something far stranger, far more terrifying than a demand for thanks or even for vengeance. "You mean I'm what, a guardian?" "A keeper," Standing Eagle nodded, a subtle tilt of his head. "And that bond must be honored, or the spirit of Lone Bird will not rest." The name struck Elias like a hammer blow. Lone Bird. The boy had a name now forever tied, by custom, by law, by an ancient belief system Elias couldn't comprehend, to a solitary rancher who had only meant to offer warmth, a moment of kindness in a world that rarely offered any. Elias looked past Standing Eagle, his gaze sweeping over the 200 warriors who still hadn't moved, still watched in silent, unnerving unity. "What does that mean for me?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, the enormity of the situation beginning to settle around him. The Apache leader's eyes didn't blink, their intensity unwavering. "It means, Elias McCready, that you are now part of something larger, and the spirit world is watching." The weight of the unspoken hung heavy between them, a palpable, almost physical presence pressing down on Elias, forcing him to confront a reality far beyond his understanding of fences and cattle. Elias lowered the rifle completely now, though he didn't drop it, letting it hang limply by his side. "I don't understand," he said, his voice raspy with a mixture of fear and profound bewilderment. "You're telling me your people believe I've inherited this boy's soul?" The very idea felt alien, a concept so far removed from his practical, earthbound life, so antithetical to the logical Christian worldview he'd always known. Standing Eagle's gaze didn't waver, holding Elias's with an almost hypnotic intensity. "Not inherited," he corrected, his voice firm, precise. "Been entrusted." His final moments were not spent alone. He passed with dignity, wrapped in warmth, with another beside him. That means something to us, something profound. The wind rustled the cottonwoods in the distance, the same trees where Elias had found the boy, their branches now whispering secrets he was only just beginning to hear. "I didn't do it for meaning," Elias muttered, shaking his head, trying to anchor himself back to the tangible. "I did it because no child should die like that, not out there, not alone." Yet Standing Eagle's next words peeled back another layer, revealing a deeper truth Elias hadn't even known he possessed. "And yet," Standing Eagle said, his voice quiet but resonant, "you did more than most ever would. You gave him your wife's blanket, did you not?" Elias's chest tightened, a sharp, unexpected pang of grief mingling with the escalating fear. The blue wool blanket, hand-stitched by his late wife Anna, before the fever had taken her and Maggie, leaving him utterly alone. It was the last tangible thing he had that still carried her scent, still held the warmth of her touch, a relic of a life shattered. He hadn't even hesitated that day by the creek. He was freezing, Elias said, his voice rough, choked with a sudden rush of memory. And I couldn't just leave him like that, not with that cold. That blanket, Standing Eagle declared, his voice rising, carrying across the silent expanse, is now sacred. It carries Lone Bird's spirit, and through it, so do you. The air between them felt heavier now, as if the weight of unseen eyes, of ancient spirits, pressed down, watching, judging. "You're saying I'm part of your tribe now?" Elias scoffed, a dry, humorless sound escaping his lips. "Because I gave a dying boy a blanket?" The absurdity of it, yet the profound gravity in Standing Eagle's eyes, created an unbearable tension. "You performed a rite of death," Standing Eagle said calmly, patiently, as if instructing a child. "One that our own medicine men reserve for honored warriors. You sang to him." "I hummed," Elias quickly corrected, a nervous tremor in his voice. "Didn't even know the tune, just a comfort." "He died in peace. That is all that matters." The simplicity of the statement was disarming, absolute. Elias rubbed the back of his neck, feeling the coarse hair, trying to grasp the enormity of what was being laid at his feet, this impossible ancient burden. "So what happens now?" The Apache leader stepped forward, closing the remaining distance. "Now the spirits must be honored, and that requires trials." "Trials?" Elias's voice was a ragged whisper. "You must prove yourself worthy of being Lone Bird's spiritual keeper. If you pass, the bond is accepted. His spirit rests. You walk away free, and perhaps not alone."
"If you fail." Standing Eagle paused, letting the ominous implication hang thick and heavy in the silent air, a threat more potent than any spoken word. Elias swallowed hard, his throat dry. "What happens if I fail?" Standing Eagle's voice dropped, becoming a low, resonant rumble. "Then the spirit belongs to us again, and all that you have, this land, this house, your name, will be claimed by Apache law." It wasn't a threat, Elias realized with a chilling jolt. It was tradition, uncompromising, inescapable. A declaration of an ancient order that stood outside the reach of any white man's law. Elias stared at the dust beneath his boots, the rifle now limp in his hand, a useless extension of his despair. He hadn't asked for any of this. He had simply tried to do a good deed, a small act of mercy. But now they had found him. The world he thought he knew, the quiet, isolated existence he'd carved out for himself, was crumbling under the weight of an unexpected, profound responsibility. Standing Eagle's tone softened, a flicker of something almost akin to empathy in his dark eyes. "There is honor in what you did, Elias McCready, but honor comes with responsibility, and we are not the only ones who've noticed." Before Elias could ask what he meant, before he could even process the full weight of the words, another sound, sharp and desperate, pierced the morning stillness. A child's cry, high, thin, distant. "Help me!" Elias's head snapped toward the hills, his personal dread instantly replaced by a more primal, universal terror. And the Apache warriors, for the first time since their terrifying arrival, moved, a silent, disciplined ripple across the prairie. The child's voice, a thin, broken sound, rang out again, barely carried by the relentless Kansas wind. "Help! Someone!" Elias's heart lurched, a painful contraction in his chest. His boots were already crunching gravel before he even registered that he'd moved, an instinctive surge towards the sound of distress. But a hand, strong and unyielding like ire, clamped around his arm, stopping him cold. "Wait!" Standing Eagle's voice cut through the rising panic.
"That's a child!" Elias snapped, twisting to face the Apache leader, his own voice raw with a desperate urgency that defied their current standoff. "That's your lone bird's voice!" The thought that this could be the same boy, somehow returned, or a relative, amplified the ache in his chest. "It may be," the Apache leader nodded, his expression unreadable, yet his eyes held a flicker of something ancient and cautious. "Or it may be a trap. Buffalo soldiers have used wounded children before, bait to lure warriors into ambush. They know our code, our instincts." Elias turned on him, fury burning, momentarily forgetting the 200 silent warriors, forgetting his own precarious position. "I don't care. If that's a trap, I'll spring it myself. But if it's that boy, and I do nothing, he dies again. And I'll be damned if I let that happen, not after what I saw yesterday." The words burst out, fueled by a visceral need to act, a profound refusal to stand by while a child suffered. It was the deepest part of him, the buried decency that had driven him to comfort Lone Bird, now screaming for action. Standing Eagle held his gaze for a long beat, his dark eyes searching Elias's, weighing his sincerity, his resolve. The silence stretched, taut and electric, while the distant, faint cries continued to drift on the wind. Then, slowly, deliberately, Standing Eagle lifted his hand. It was a single, imperious gesture. Without a word, 20 Apache warriors dismounted in one fluid, practiced motion, their movements precise and economical. They melted away from the main group, already moving towards the sound in a wide flanking pattern. Ghosts on horseback, now shadows among the sagebrush and granite outcroppings. Elias exhaled hard, a shaky breath escaping him, shaken not just by their compliance, but by their chilling precision. These weren't unruly raiders driven by greed or chaos. These were disciplined, lethal soldiers, moving with a silent efficiency that was both terrifying and strangely reassuring. "They will determine the truth," Standing Eagle said, his voice calm once more, though still carrying the weight of command. "And if the boy lives, your trial begins." "My what?" Elias asked, bewildered, the previous conversation about spirits and keepers suddenly rushing back, colliding with the immediate, tangible crisis. "Your first test. The spirits do not wait for ceremony. They create their own." The words resonated with a primal authority, suggesting a force at play far beyond human control or understanding. Minutes passed like years, each tick of the clock amplifying the distant cries, each second stretching the nerve-wracking suspense. Then, finally, one scout reappeared from the ridge, a dark silhouette against the morning sky, signaling urgently with a series of rapid hand gestures. Standing Eagle watched, his face impassive, then turned back to Elias. The child is there, alive, but trapped. The old mine shaft collapsed. Elias felt his chest collapse inward, a cold, empty feeling replacing the panic. The mines, abandoned since 1871, forgotten relics of a fleeting silver rush, were notorious death traps, unstable and prone to cave-ins. "How deep?" Elias asked, his mind already racing, scanning the nearby barn for ropes, planks, anything that could help. 15 feet, Standing Eagle said, his gaze fixed on the distant ridge. "The walls are unstable. Any wrong movement could bring the whole shaft down." Elias's thoughts tumbled, a desperate scramble for solutions. "We'll need beams to brace the walls, shoring planks, maybe a pulley rig. We could use the horse." "There's no time," Standing Eagle cut in, his voice sharp, decisive. "The supports are failing. Our scouts estimate less than 20 minutes before full collapse." The words were a death knell, echoing the frantic thumping of Elias's heart. Panic surged again, cold and nauseating. So what do you expect me to do? Crawl in there and pull him out with my bare hands?" Elias's voice was hoarse, edged with a rising hysteria. The futility of it, the sheer impossibility clawed at him. Standing Eagle shook his head, his dark eyes holding an unyielding calm. "No, you must decide how to act. That is the test." Elias blinked, the word echoing strangely in the urgent air. "Decide?" The Apache elder stepped closer, his voice low and even, a stark contrast to the escalating chaos in Elias's mind. "Our medicine man, Silent Thunder, believes he can speak to the spirits of the mine. Ask them to hold the rock." Elias's mouth opened, then closed, a gasp caught in his throat. Speak? To the mine? The concept was utterly alien, bordering on madness. Elias just stepped into a world beyond his wildest imagination. Want to understand the true depths of this story? Hit subscribe and don't miss a moment. "To the mountain," Standing Eagle corrected, his gaze unwavering, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. "To the spirits inside it. He worked those tunnels before the wars. He knows their weaknesses. He knows their heart." "So he's a geologist now?" Elias scoffed, a desperate, nervous laugh escaping him. It was a crude attempt at humor, a way to cling to the logical, rational world that was rapidly slipping away. Standing Eagle's gaze never wavered, a silent reproof. "He listens with his hands, with his soul. But it only works if those involved believe, fully, without doubt." Elias stared at him, the weight of the impossible request settling heavily. "You're asking me to put my life and his on a chant, on faith?" "I am asking," Standing Eagle said quietly, his voice a soft, compelling murmur, "if you will trust something beyond yourself. Beyond the world you understand, beyond your machines and your practical solutions." Another small voice floated from the ridge, weaker now, barely a whisper. "Please." Elias's chest ached, a profound, sympathetic pain for the unseen child. He looked at the Apache warriors, still silent, their stoic presence a testament to an unshakable belief. He looked at Standing Eagle, calm, unwavering, radiating a quiet, absolute conviction. And he looked at the hill, where a boy lay broken under the earth, his life hanging by a thread, waiting for a choice. And Elias McCready, a man who had sworn off belief, a man who had only ever trusted in hard work and cold steel, made his choice. "Then let's go," Elias said, his voice firm, resolute, pushing past his fear, past his skepticism. "Show me how to talk to stone." The words were a leap of faith, a surrender to the unknown, a decision that would redefine his very existence. The wind rustled through the dry grass, carrying the faint, desperate cry of the trapped boy. Then, as if birthed from the very earth, Silent Thunder simply appeared. The old Apache medicine man stood at the jagged, gaping maw of the mine shaft, small and wiry, wrapped in hides and beads, his long, dark hair braided tight with bone and stone. But it was his eyes that truly silenced Elias, eyes that had watched generations burn under the harsh sun, eyes that still blinked slow, ancient, and utterly without fear, holding the wisdom of centuries. He offered no greeting, no handshake, no acknowledgement of Elias's presence beyond a brief, piercing glance. Instead, he knelt at the raw, broken opening of the shaft and placed his palm flat on the trembling earth. For nearly a full minute, he stayed motionless, utterly still, as if listening intently to something the wind couldn't carry, a pulse beat from the very heart of the mountain. Then, with a fluid, deliberate motion, he opened a small, worn leather pouch and began to arrange a half-circle of colored stones and carved bones on the dirt beside the shaft. His fingers moved with ritual precision, each placement purposeful, yet there was no theatrics, no showmanship, only a quiet, profound reverence for the task. "He's asking the mountain to wait," Standing Eagle said softly beside Elias, his voice a low murmur that seemed to blend with the rustling grass. But more than that, he's reading it, feeling the vibrations in the stone, the heat of the rock, the subtle sound of settling earth. Elias knelt beside the old man, utterly captivated, watching his gnarled hands, so delicate in their movements, so powerful in their purpose. "You're telling me he knows when it'll come down?" Elias whispered, the skepticism warring with a growing, reluctant awe. Standing Eagle nodded, his gaze fixed on Silent Thunder. "He worked this mine 20 years ago, when he was a young man. He knows the voice of this mountain better than anyone alive. He knows its moods, its weaknesses, its spirit." A long, low chant began to hum from Silent Thunder's throat, a sound that seemed to rise from the very depths of the earth. It wasn't melodic in any human sense, more like the deep, resonant rumble of thunder echoing through a vast, cavernous canyon, a sound that vibrated in Elias's bones. "Is he praying?" Elias asked, his voice barely audible. "In part," Standing Eagle replied, "but he's also guiding the air, listening to how it bounces back, where it stops, where it trembles, where it sings of a coming break." Elias stared down into the dark, yawning mouth of the shaft, a black abyss of uncertainty. "And if he's wrong?" Standing Eagle's reply was stark, unblinking. "Then the earth swallows another soul, and two worlds will lose a bridge." A cold sweat broke across Elias's neck, a sudden understanding of the absolute stakes. Silent Thunder paused his chanting, his head tilted as if listening to an inner voice. Then he turned his ancient, seeing eyes to Elias, speaking in low, broken English, each word weighted with ancestral knowledge. "You go down, white man. You listen, like I do." Elias hesitated, his practical mind balking. "I'm not trained for this," he said, gesturing vaguely at his own sturdy frame. "I'm not light, I'm not—" "You carry soul," Silent Thunder interrupted, his voice surprisingly firm, tapping Elias's chest once with a bony finger. "Spirit, know your name now. Spirit, know your burden." He pointed at Elias's heavy boots, his leather belt, even the small metal buttons on his denim shirt. Standing Eagle, sensing Elias's confusion, translated the deeper meaning. Weight must go. Steel must go. Anything not needed, gone. You must become part of the mountain, not a burden on it. You must flow like water, not fight like rock. In silence, a solemn, almost ceremonial act, Elias stripped down to a soft linen undershirt, removed his belt, his heavy boots, the ever-present Winchester, and even the gold wedding ring that had remained on his finger since Anna's death, a constant, aching reminder of his loss. Each item shed felt like a layer of his old life, his old self falling away. Standing Eagle handed him a length of braided leather rope, surprisingly soft, yet undeniably strong. "This will hold you both if the anchors remain. But once you're down there, it's all feel. No sudden movements, no panic. Move like water, not like man. Breathe like the wind." Elias nodded, trying to swallow the hot, metallic taste of fear in his mouth. Silent Thunder placed a final, smooth stone near the shaft opening, his eyes still fixed on Elias. He gripped Elias's forearm, his touch surprisingly strong. "Mountain test you," he whispered, his ancient eyes locking onto Elias's. "You go down, white man, but come up, father." Elias took one last lingering look at the cloudy Kansas sky, at the 200 Apache warriors standing in silent, unwavering stillness, then turned to the gaping dark mouth of the shaft and lowered himself into the earth. The mountain, a silent, ancient entity, waited, its breath held, its patience tested. The first rung groaned beneath Elias's bare foot, a sound like a dying whisper echoing in the suffocating darkness. He froze, every muscle tensed, listening, waiting. No immediate echo of collapse, no terrifying rumble, just the slow, raspy breath of the mountain pressing in around him, a living, breathing entity. Above, silent thunder's chanting rose again, a low, rhythmic hum that seemed to blend seamlessly with the very air, as if it had always been there, an ancient lullaby for the trembling earth. Elias moved again, carefully, deliberately, each descent a conversation, between him and the ancient timbers of the shaft, between his own trembling spirit and the stone that remembered the boots of countless miners, the echoes of their labored breaths. He tested each rung, breathing slow, shallow, letting the profound silence guide him more than his limited sight. At 10 feet, the air changed subtly, growing damp, close, like the constricted lungs of the mountain exhaled only inward. The scent of damp earth and stale minerals filled his nostrils. Below, a soft, small voice broke through the oppressive dark, a sound of fragility and fear. "Help!" Elias swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I'm here," he whispered, his voice cracking slightly. "Don't move, all right? Just talk to me, son." The boy whimpered, a sound of pure terror and pain. "I can't move my leg. It hurts so bad." "I know, son. Just stay still. I'm coming for you." As Elias neared the narrow ledge where the boy lay trapped, he saw him. A small, crumpled figure huddled against the cold stone shelf, one leg bent at an impossible, grotesque angle. His face was streaked with dirt and fear, but his eyes were wide, clear, and utterly terrified, reflecting the flickering beam of Elias's lamp. "It's falling," the boy said, his voice barely a breath, filled with a child's raw honesty. "I heard it cracking all around me." "You're safe for now," Elias lied, his voice a soothing, low murmur, though every fiber of his being screamed otherwise. "But we have to be quiet, no sudden moves. The mountain is listening." As if on cue, the shaft above them groaned, a deep, resonant rumble, a chilling, unambiguous warning from the earth itself. Elias reached the ledge and slowly, painstakingly shifted his weight, spreading it as Standing Eagle had intuitively taught him, across his palms, his feet, his knees. Every inch of his body in contact with the rock, sharing the pressure, becoming one with the precarious structure. "You're not Apache," the boy whispered, his eyes wide, still searching, questioning. "No," Elias said softly, gently, "but I'm here because I gave you something to remember." "The blanket," the boy murmured, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. Elias nodded, a silent acknowledgement. The boy's lip trembled, a small, fragile tremor. "I kept it, even when I was scared. It felt like my mother." The words struck Elias harder than the cold stone beneath him, a sudden sharp ache in his own chest. "That blanket belonged to my wife, Anna," Elias said, his voice rough with emotion, the memories of his lost family washing over him. "She made it before she died, but yesterday it became yours, a gift from one heart to another." The shaft groaned again, louder this time, a deeper, more urgent warning, the ominous sound reverberating through the rock. Elias reached into his satchel, his hands shaking slightly, pulled out the crude harness, a simple sling of braided leather rope he'd fashioned, and began wrapping it around the boy, carefully, gently. "You're going to be all right, son," he whispered, offering a hope he wasn't sure he could deliver. "But we have to move together. One wrong tug, one sudden jolt, and this whole place collapses around us. We have to be as one." "Are you scared?" the boy asked, his small voice surprisingly clear, cutting through Elias's own rising panic. "Yes," Elias admitted, his gaze meeting the boy's, offering honesty rather than false bravado. "But fear's not what kills you. Rushing does. Panic does." From above, a sharp, piercing whistle suddenly cut through the air, Standing Eagle's signal. The boy's eyes grew wide, filled with renewed terror. "What's that?" he whispered. "Our cue," Elias whispered back, his voice firm, resolute. "Time to move." As he secured the final knot, a deep, unsettling shiver ran through the ancient wooden supports above them. The mountain had heard them, and now, its patience exhausted, it was deciding their fate. Elias tightened the final knot, his fingers trembling, slick with sweat and dust. The leather cords creaked ominously under the strain, but they held. The boy was secured to him now, 2 lives bound by one fraying, desperate thread. With a surge of adrenaline, Elias gave a sharp tug upward, 3 quick pulses, the prearranged signal to the Apache above. Above, the rope jerked once in reply, a silent confirmation. The Apache had received the signal. Then came the first pull. Slow, controlled. The rope rose inch by agonizing inch, grinding softly against the shaft's cold, unforgiving stone walls. Elias kept his body arched like a bow, a human shield, tucking the boy securely against his chest, protecting him from the constant rain of dust and small debris. The child's head was buried deep against Elias's chest, breathing fast, shallow gasps, whispering things Elias couldn't understand. Prayers, fears, or perhaps fragments of a forgotten Apache lullaby. Halfway up, a gut-wrenching groan split the shaft, a deep, ancient noise like the very bones of the mountain shifting, protesting their intrusion. Then the dust came, not a gentle sifting, but a choking, blinding downpour. Fine particles rained down, forcing Elias to squint, his eyes stinging. He didn't dare wipe them. Every handhold, every ounce of strength was critical. He felt it in the rope's sudden, alarming tension, in the abrupt stutter of their slow ascent. One of the upper beams, old and rotted, had cracked. Another tug from above, sharper this time. The Apache were adjusting course, shifting their angle, working with a desperate precision that spoke of their awareness. They knew, they heard it too. "Stay still," Elias breathed to the boy, his voice a hoarse whisper, raw with exertion and fear. "We're almost there, son. Just hold on, son." Another foot, then another. He could see daylight now, a muted, dusty gray through the constricted mouth of the shaft, a promise of escape. Then the child made a small noise, not fear this time, but a sharp, undeniable gasp of pain. His broken leg had brushed hard against the rough wall. And the mountain screamed. One of the main upper beams, a massive timber, gave way with a thunderclap that reverberated through the earth, splinters raining down like lethal arrows, followed by the sickening cascade of dislodged rock. Elias twisted instinctively, tucking the boy even tighter against his chest, using his own body as a shield as fist-sized rocks began to fall around them, thudding with terrifying force. A tug from above turned into a violent yank. The Apache were pulling faster now, desperately, urgently, their grim determination palpable even through the rope. Elias felt the coarse rope bite cruelly into his ribs, the crushing weight straining across his spine, threatening to tear him apart. Then, suddenly, hands.
Dozens of them, rough, calloused, impossibly strong.
They reached down into the darkness, seizing Elias and the boy, pulling them with a fierce, primal strength into the blinding, dusty light of day. Just as they cleared the opening, the entire shaft behind them imploded with a deafening roar, like 100 buffalo charging in unison. Dust exploded into the sky, a towering, choking cloud that blotted out the sun, shaking the very ground beneath them. Elias lay on the dirt, coughing, his lungs burning. The boy still pressed protectively against him, miraculously alive. They were alive. Barely. Above them, Apache warriors were shouting, not in panic, but in warning. Standing Eagle, his face taut with grim concern, ran forward, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Cavalry," he said grimly, his voice a low, urgent growl that cut through the ringing in Elias's ears. "A patrol is approaching. 30 men. They saw the smoke. They smelled the dust." Elias pushed himself up, heart still hammering against his ribs, adrenaline coursing through him. "They'll think you attacked us," he rasped, the terrible irony of the situation dawning on him. "They'll think we're dead." "They'll act on fear," Standing Eagle replied, his eyes narrowing, fixed on the distant thunder of hooves. "Not truth. Their truth is war." And somewhere in the distance, the rhythmic, ominous thunder of approaching hooves began to shake the very earth once more, signaling a new, perhaps even deadlier, confrontation. The first soldiers crested the ridge like a wave of blue steel and gunpowder, their appearance a jarring, violent intrusion on the tense, dust-choked scene. Dust swirled around the thundering hooves of 30 cavalry mounts, sabers glinting menacingly, carbines raised and ready. At their head, a young officer, Lieutenant Harris of the 5th Cavalry, a man whose uniform still seemed too new, drew rein sharply and shouted down across the valley, "Lower your weapons and surrender immediately. You are surrounded!" His voice, though young, carried the rigid authority of military law. Elias staggered to his feet, still dazed and disoriented from the choking dust and the raw terror of the rescue. The child, small and fragile, clung to his side, silent and trembling, burying his face against Elias's hip. Standing Eagle stepped forward slowly, deliberately, his hands raised high, palms open, a universal gesture of peace and non-aggression. "We are not here for war," he called back in flawless English, his voice clear and resonant, cutting through the lieutenant's bluster. "We've just pulled this man and boy from a collapsed mine. No one is harmed. We seek peace, not conflict." The lieutenant, however, did not lower his weapon. His face was a mask of suspicion, his eyes darting between the unarmed Elias and the 200 formidable warriors behind Standing Eagle. "I see 200 armed Apache warriors on private property," he barked, his voice laced with unshakable prejudice. "That's not peace. That's an ambush, you savage!" "They saved my life," Elias shouted, his voice raw, stepping bravely between the silent line of Apache warriors and the advancing cavalry. He put himself squarely in the path of the approaching confrontation, a frail human bridge. "They saved his life," he gestured to the boy clinging to him. But Harris was already signaling, his arm cutting through the air. Riders fanned out, their movements disciplined and swift, forming a crescent of steel and firepower. Triggers tightened. The powdery air, thick with dust and the scent of horses and fear, pulsed with the volatile kindling of impending violence. Then something happened no one expected, something that defied every frontier narrative, every ingrained prejudice. The Apache moved, together, as one. In an eerie, unified silence, every single warrior dismounted from his horse. Then, with a quiet, deliberate grace that spoke volumes, they laid their rifles, their bows, their spears, their knives, every single weapon, carefully on the dirt, one by one. Then, in unison, they raised their hands, empty, open, palms facing the shocked cavalry.
200 warriors standing unarmed in the open, surrounding Elias and the child, not as captors, not as enemies, but as protectors. The cavalry faltered. Confusion rippled down the line like a dropped flag, a wave of stunned disbelief. Lieutenant Harris blinked, his pistol still raised, slowly lowering by inches, his young face etched with profound bewilderment. What is this?" he muttered, the question more to himself than to anyone else, his voice losing its rigid military edge. Standing Eagle stepped closer, his voice steady as granite, his gaze holding the lieutenant's. This man, Elias McCready, gave comfort to a dying Apache child. He offered warmth and dignity when he could have turned away, when the easy path was to leave him to the vultures. That child's spirit now binds him to us. He is one of us, by sacred choice, by an act of pure heart. The lieutenant stared, first at Elias, then at the small, trembling boy beside him, then at the still smoldering mine shaft behind them, a monument to their shared peril and miraculous escape. "This is madness," Harris muttered, shaking his head, trying to reconcile the impossible with his ingrained beliefs. "Apaches don't help settlers, they raid them, they kill them." Elias's voice, though still rough, cut through the tension with a sudden, defiant clarity. "And maybe we're all damned fools for believing that has to be true, Lieutenant. Maybe there's a different way to live out here." Silence fell again, but this time it didn't feel like fear. It felt like choice. A profound, uncomfortable moment of decision for every man present. Standing Eagle glanced towards the boy, a subtle acknowledgment of his fragile presence, then back to Harris, his eyes unwavering. "We have no claim on your land, white man. We ask only for truth to be seen, and for this man, Elias McCready, to finish what the spirits have begun, to fulfill his sacred bond." The lieutenant slowly, deliberately holstered his weapon, and for the first time since arriving, his rigid military bearing seemed to drop. He didn't look like a soldier anymore. He looked like a man trying, desperately, to understand the impossible, standing at the crossroads of two worlds, two truths. The silence that followed Elias's defiant words hung heavy, thick with the tension between the two armed camps. Lieutenant Harris stood motionless, his face a mask of bewildered contemplation, his military training warring with the impossible reality unfolding before him. Elias stepped forward, the boy's small hand still clutched tightly in his, a fragile connection that felt profoundly strong. "If this ends now," Elias said, his voice carrying conviction, "let it end with truth, Lieutenant, not with bullets." Standing Eagle met Elias's gaze, a flicker of ancient approval in his eyes, then turned to face the stunned soldiers. "This was only the first trial," he announced, his voice resonating across the prairie. "By Apache law, Elias McCready must pass 2 more. Only then can he be freed of the spirit's claim, or embrace it fully." Harris frowned, a ripple of confusion crossing his face. "You're saying he's under tribal judgment, like a prisoner?" "It is not judgment," Standing Eagle replied, his tone unwavering. "It is honor, a path for the spirit to find peace, and for a bond to be forged." The word honor settled over the field like a hush of falling ash, a concept far removed from the brutal realities of the frontier Harris understood. Elias squared his shoulders, facing the towering warrior, a flicker of resignation, but also resolve in his eyes. "What's next?" he asked, ready for whatever impossible demand would come. Standing Eagle's eyes narrowed, a deeper intensity entering their depths. "The second test is sacrifice," he said, his voice slow and deliberate. "Yesterday, the boy you comforted, Lone Bird, was ready to die. He'd given everything, his blood, his pain, his pride. And your gift to him, your blanket, was your most sacred possession, the last thread of a life you cherished. You gave it freely, without thought of return." Elias said nothing, his jaw clenched, his gaze fixed on the dust. He knew where this was going, the cold dread returning to his gut. Standing Eagle raised his voice, ensuring all could hear, both Apache and cavalry. "To prove your understanding, to match your daughter's gift with your own, you must now give us your land, this ranch, this home." Gasps rippled through the cavalry line. Lieutenant Harris, momentarily forgetting his bewilderment, stepped forward, his hand instinctively resting on his holstered pistol. "That's extortion, Chief. You can't just take a man's property." Standing Eagle didn't even glance at him, his gaze fixed solely on Elias. "It is tradition, the land for the spirit, a sacred exchange, a giving of roots for the freedom of a soul." Elias stood frozen, the demand a crushing weight. He looked at the dust beneath his boots, at the rough-hewn porch his wife had helped him build, the fence lines he dug by hand, each post a testament to his toil and sorrow. This ranch was everything. It was Anna. It was Maggie. It was memory, scarred but enduring. It was the last vestige of the life he had lost. And now it might be gone, consumed by a spiritual debt he never intended to incur. The boy, still clinging to his sleeve, tugged gently. "You don't have to," he whispered, his small voice filled with a child's simple plea. Elias looked down, his eyes stinging, a wave of profound sorrow and desperate resolve washing over him. "I already did, son," he said softly, almost to himself. "When I gave that blanket, the choice was made then." Then, louder for all to hear, for the spirits and for the rigid soldiers and for the stoic Apache, "Where do I sign?" A long, profound pause. The wind seemed to hold its breath. Then a slow, gentle smile spread across Standing Eagle's face, a rare and deeply human expression that transformed his stern features. "You do not sign anything, Elias McCready," he said, his voice soft, almost a whisper, yet clear as a bell. "This was the test, not the land itself, but your heart, your willingness to let go. And it has spoken true. It has shown us what we needed to see." Relief collapsed Elias's knees. The tension that had been caged in his chest since morning, since the Apache appeared on the horizon, burst forth in a long, shaky exhale. He dropped into the dirt, feeling the grit of the earth under his palms, his body trembling with the sudden release. But Standing Eagle wasn't finished. He stood over Elias, his presence still commanding. "One test remains," he said, his voice becoming solemn again. "The hardest and the simplest." Elias looked up, his eyes searching the Apache leader's face, ready for any impossible task. "You must raise him," Standing Eagle said, nodding towards the boy, who still stood silently beside Elias, his small hand now clutching Elias's shirt. "As both Apache and settler, you must honor both sides of who he is now. Teach him your way, learn ours. Be the bridge between our peoples, for his sake and for the sake of the land." The boy blinked up at Elias, his eyes wide, expectant, trusting. Elias blinked back, the enormity of the task, the profound and unexpected gift settling over him. And without thinking, without hesitation, he nodded. "I will," he said, the words a sacred vow. And as the sun, finally breaking through the smoke-filled sky, cast long golden shadows across the ranch, Standing Eagle whispered something ancient into the wind, a blessing Elias couldn't understand, but whose meaning he felt deep in his soul. The spirits had chosen, and Elias McCready had answered, not as a victim, but as a willing participant in a new, unforeseen destiny. The wind shifted once more, carrying no threat, only a palpable sense of release, as if the land itself had exhaled, relieved that the man at its center had chosen rightly. The Apache warriors, their faces softened, began to move, silently, returning their weapons to sheaths. It was an act born not of fear, but of profound respect and burgeoning trust. Lieutenant Harris, still stunned, watched as the boy, his broken leg splinted, stepped toward Standing Eagle. The warrior knelt, not as a leader, but as one soul to another. "Lone Bird's spirit rests now," Standing Eagle murmured, pressing a small leather bundle into the boy's palm. "He walks with you, and through you, with this man." The boy looked back at Elias, uncertain. Elias knelt beside him. "I'm not Apache," he said softly. "I don't know the songs or stories, but I know how to fix a fence, plant beans, and listen. Maybe we can teach each other." The boy stared, then placed the bundle, a piece of Anna's blanket, in Elias's hand. "You gave it," the boy whispered, "but Lone Bird said you should have it back." Emotion cracked something in Elias's chest. He held the wool square like it was glass, then looked at Standing Eagle. "I don't know what happens now," he said, his voice firm, "but I meant what I said. I'll raise him, however you need me to." Standing Eagle placed a firm hand on Elias's shoulder. "He is yours, and ours, a child of two worlds. And you, Elias McCready, are now his bridge." A final gust of wind swept across the plains, carrying an ancient, silent understanding. Older than borders, deeper than blood. The warriors began to mount. No drums, no celebration, just the quiet dignity of warriors departing from a ceremony fulfilled. Lieutenant Harris approached Elias. "You realize," he said, "this goes against every regulation we have." Elias stood tall, the boy at his side. "Then maybe it's the regulations that need changing." Harris stared a moment longer, then saluted, not to the army, but to the man. As the cavalry rode west and the Apache rode east, only Elias and the boy remained in the dust-choked yard, alone, together, at the edge of something new. The ranch, once a hollow echo of loss, now stirred with comforting life. Weeks became months. The boy, Elias now called River, moved through the land with natural grace, learning to muck stalls and mend fences, teaching Elias Apache words in return. At night, by the fire pit, River told ancient tales of mountains and spirits. Elias listened, letting the narratives heal his sorrow. Word of McCready's ranch spread. Settlers came cautiously, then with curiosity, finding a man and a boy sharing peace. The ranch transformed into a sanctuary. Buffalo soldiers paused patrols, sharing coffee, leaving with unsettling questions. Apache traders stopped without fear, leaving tokens of respect. No one called it a miracle, but all remembered. One autumn morning, Elias opened a chest, finding the rest of Anna's blanket. He gave it to River. "This belonged to your brother," he said. "It's yours now, all of it." River touched it like it was sacred. "You gave it away," he said. "That was harder." Elias smiled. "Maybe, but giving it back feels right." River draped it over Elias's shoulders. "Now it belongs to both." That night, Elias lit the first fire in the lodge he had built with River. Settlers and Apache sat side by side, a single blue wool blanket resting between them, mended, shared, eternal. Years sifted by. River grew tall, a living bridge, speaking two tongues, belonging to both worlds.
Elias aged slower, walking not as a survivor, but as a man shaping the future. The ranch became sacred. Children came to learn, men to listen. Even cavalry officers returned with questions. The blue wool blanket, always on the mantel, was memory. It was the thread that stitched together a dying boy, a grieving man, and a world that had forgotten how to listen.
On the day Elias died, peacefully beneath the cottonwoods, River sat beside him. No last words, just a steady breath, then silence. Tribes and settlers came, no speeches. The wind spoke enough. They buried him with warrior stones, and River placed the blanket over his grave, covering it with earth. That evening, an elder Apache woman told the children how Elias McCready became the bridge the land had waited for. The children listened, carrying the story like coals in their hearts. River stayed, teaching. Children came from both towns and camps, learning to track deer and listen to the wind, to silences that held more than words. He was no chief, no preacher, but people came when fences broke, hearts confused, seeking understanding. The lodge became council, the ranch refuge. The cottonwoods stood, roots wrapped around the memory of lone bird Elias and a moment that cracked history wide open. 20 winters after Elias's death, River found a boy waiting at the gate, a blue wool scrap in his hand. River knelt, took the cloth, and smiled. "You gave him your blanket, didn't you?" The boy nodded. River looked at the cottonwoods. "Then the spirits have chosen again." He opened the gate. The circle began once more. The wind still changes its song over Elias McCready's land, carrying whispers. Some say children sing to the dying. Others say cottonwoods whisper stories. All agree, 2 worlds stopped killing long enough to listen, and the earth remembered. A trail north of the lodge, worn by returning footsteps, leads people without guns, with questions, with hope.
The Apache call it the place of the blanket. Settlers call it Peacefield. Both names carry truth. At the lodge, River's children might tell the story. A man gave his last piece of love to a stranger. The spirits gave him something greater, a second life, a child of mercy, a war avoided by blankets, a choice made out of decency. And if you ask what became of them, they're still here, just quieter now, making sure the blanket still holds.